Why did you do that?
I only had one deep freezer.
And you feel no remorse for that?
I would kill him again.
Case 1. Michelle Blair, Detroit, Michigan, 2012 to 2015. On March 24, 2015, court officers arrived at a small apartment on the east side of Detroit. Their task was administrative and routine: serve an eviction notice on a tenant behind on rent. They knocked. They entered. They began the standard process. Then one of them opened the freezer. Inside, wrapped in plastic, were 2 children. Frozen, contorted, stacked. Their faces, preserved by the cold, showed expressions that investigators would later describe in court in terms that were deeply difficult to read into the record. They had been there for years. The woman who lived in that apartment was Michelle Blair, 35 years old, a mother of 4. She was present when the officers arrived. Her 2 surviving daughters were there as well. Within hours, Blair was in police custody, and within hours of that, she confessed. What she described was not a single act of violence. It was a sustained, years-long campaign of torture against 2 of her children, her 9-year-old son Stephen and her 13-year-old daughter Stoney, that had ended in their deaths and culminated in their storage in a freezer in the family's kitchen. Blair's stated justification was that both Stephen and Stoney had sexually abused her youngest child. Whether that claim was true has never been fully established. But even if taken entirely at face value, it explains nothing of what she then did. According to Blair's own account to investigators, Stephen's final months in 2012 were a documented sequence of escalating torture. She beat him with extension cords until his skin split open. She poured scalding water on him. She placed plastic bags over his head until he lost consciousness, then removed them to allow him to regain awareness, only to repeat the process. She forced him to consume household chemicals. When she decided she was finished, she strangled him with her hands. She placed his body in the freezer. 9 months later, she turned on Stoney. The pattern followed the same trajectory: beatings, starvation, suffocation, until Stoney died, and Blair put her in the freezer above her brother. For the next 2 years, Michelle Blair lived in that apartment with her 2 surviving daughters. The girls were told never to open the freezer. School officials, social services, and neighbors had not seen Stephen or Stoney in years. Their absence had not generated an investigation. No one had demanded an explanation. No one had knocked on the door and asked where the children were. The eviction officers found them. At trial, Blair's courtroom behavior became almost as notorious as the crimes themselves. She expressed no remorse. She shouted at prosecutors. She cursed the fathers of her children. She told the court she did not feel remorse for the deaths of what she called demons. She said she would kill again if she found abuse occurring. Even the judge, a man who had presided over decades of serious criminal cases, stated publicly that he had never witnessed such raw hatred in a courtroom proceeding. The surviving daughters testified. Their accounts described a household defined by threat, by the smell of the apartment, by their mother's rage, and by the knowledge, communicated clearly and early, that disobeying their mother could mean becoming what was in the freezer. In June 2015, Michelle Blair was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole on 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of torture. The judge described her crimes as the ultimate betrayal of motherhood. As of 2025, Blair is incarcerated at the Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility in Michigan. She has not expressed remorse in any public statement or interview since her conviction. The systemic dimension of this case, the years during which 2 children were absent from schools, from medical records, from any institutional tracking system, generated significant discussion about child welfare monitoring in Michigan in the aftermath of the trial. Stephen and Stoney had, in effect, fallen entirely through every net designed to catch children in danger. For years, nobody noticed. Before we get into the second case, welcome to Daily Crime Archive. This channel covers cases that deserve more than a headline and a 2-sentence summary. We go deep on the investigation, the legal proceedings, the victims' lives, and the questions that don't get answered in a 2-minute news segment. We are a new channel, and every subscription matters directly. If you're watching and you haven't subscribed yet, hit the button and turn on the bell. Drop a comment as you're watching. Tell us which of these cases you knew going in. We read everything. Now, Case 2, Waneta Hoyt, Cayuga County, New York, 1965 to 1971. In the rural communities of upstate New York in the 1960s and early 1970s, the medical classification known as crib death, sudden infant death syndrome, was understood imperfectly and investigated minimally. Infants died. Communities grieved. Science had few tools to probe the cause. The official cause of death was filed, and the family was offered sympathy. For one woman in Cayuga County, this gap between what was happening and what anyone could prove provided cover for nearly a decade of murder. Waneta Hoyt was born in 1946 and married Tim Hoyt at the age of 20. Their first child, Eric, arrived shortly after. In January 1965, Eric died suddenly at 3 months old. Doctors recorded crib death. The community brought casseroles and expressed condolences. Julie, the Hoyts' second child, was born months later. By September 1965, before she was 3 months old, she was dead. Crib death again. James arrived in 1966. 3 months old. Dead. Crib death. Molly was born in 1968. Same pattern. Same age. Same cause listed. Noah arrived in 1970. By the time he was 3 months old, he too was dead. 5 children. 5 sudden deaths. All in the same family. All within the first 3 months of life. All officially attributed to sudden infant death syndrome. The community had moved from sympathy to something quieter. A kind of helpless acknowledgement that the Hoyts had been marked by an incomprehensible misfortune. Waneta Hoyt accepted the sympathy. She grieved publicly. She and Tim eventually became foster parents and later adopted a 6th child, who survived. To the community, she was a woman of tragic fate. Someone the universe had treated with extraordinary cruelty. For decades this remained the story. The truth began to surface in the early 1990s, driven by advances in the understanding of SIDS that had accumulated over the preceding 20 years. By the early 1990s, epidemiological research on sudden infant death syndrome had established something critical. The statistical probability of one family losing 5 children to SIDS across the time frame and pattern of the Hoyt deaths was not merely unlikely. It was effectively impossible. A local district attorney reopened the cases. Investigators brought Waneta Hoyt in for questioning in 1994. She was in her late 40s, living an ordinary life in a quiet neighborhood. She confessed. Her account was clinical in its plainness. She described smothering each of her infants with blankets, pillows, or whatever was available. She said she had been overwhelmed by their crying. She said she needed it to stop. 5 infants. 5 separate occasions. 5 acts that she described with a casualness that investigators found, in their subsequent accounts, deeply disturbing. At trial, the defense argued that Waneta had been manipulated into confessing, that she had a cognitive profile that made her suggestible to investigative pressure, that her confession was the product of hours of interrogation rather than genuine memory. The defense presented her as impaired, easily overwhelmed, operating with the judgment of someone significantly younger than her chronological age. The prosecution countered with the statistical impossibility of 5 SIDS deaths in one household, with the pattern of each death occurring when the infant reached an age where crying becomes sustained and sleep deprivation for a caregiver becomes acute, and with the words of Waneta Hoyt's own confession. In 1995, she was convicted of 5 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to 75 years to life. She never served more than a fraction of it. In 1998, 3 years into her sentence, Waneta Hoyt died of pancreatic cancer. She was 52 years old. The Hoyt case reshaped how the medical and legal communities in the United States approach repeated sudden infant deaths within a single family. Pediatricians and forensic pathologists developed new protocols for investigating such cases. Prosecutors across the country began re-examining historical cases where multiple infant deaths in one household had been quickly attributed to SIDS. What Waneta Hoyt's case established, not just legally, but medically, is that the classification of a death as natural is not the end of an investigation when the pattern defies what nature can produce. Case 3. Shelley Nunees, Raymond, Washington, 1990s to 2003. The farmhouse the Nuñez family occupied outside Raymond, Washington, looked ordinary from the road. A modest property, surrounded by forest, the kind of place that exists in hundreds of rural communities across the Pacific Northwest, without drawing particular attention. Inside, over the course of more than a decade, Shelley Nunees built and maintained one of the most complete systems of personal domination documented in modern American true crime. Shelley Nunees, born Michelle Shirley Nunees in 1954, had developed, by the time she became a mother, a sophisticated facility for manipulation. She constructed elaborate false narratives. She generated sympathy through fabricated crises. She identified the emotional dependencies of the people around her and exploited them with precision. When she had children, she did not raise them. She controlled them. Her 3 daughters, Nikki, Sammy, and Tori, grew up in a household defined by what can only be described as psychological warfare, punctuated by physical violence. Shelly beat them. She forced humiliating punishments. She starved them. She broke their resistance through cycles of cruelty and conditional affection that kept them perpetually off balance, never certain what the next hour would bring. But the household did not exist in isolation. Shelly had a pattern of inviting vulnerable people into the home, friends, relatives, boarders, who needed somewhere to go. She presented herself as generous, as someone who opened her door to those in need. And one by one, the people who walked through that door became new victims. Kathy Lorena was a hairdresser and family friend who moved in with the Nuñez family in the early 1990s. She arrived believing she had found a safe landing. What she found instead was a new form of captivity. Shelly subjected Kathy to starvation, relentless physical work, constant humiliation, and sustained physical abuse. By 1994, Kathy was dead from the accumulated effects of what had been done to her. Dave Nuñez, Shelly's husband, a Vietnam veteran whose own psychological landscape had been shaped by experiences the war had left behind, did not call the police. At Shelly's direction, he burned Kathy's body in the backyard furnace. For years, Kathy's family searched for her, not knowing she had died in that farmhouse and been incinerated in its yard. A teenage nephew named Shane Watson came to live with the family and initially befriended Shelly's daughters. He recognized what was happening in the house and began documenting it with a hidden camera. When Shelly discovered this, she ordered Dave to kill him. In 1995, Shane was shot in the head. His body was burned like Kathy's. His disappearance was explained with the same facility for lying that characterized everything Shelly did. Years later, an elderly man named Ron Woodworth moved in after falling into financial difficulty. He was starved, beaten, degraded, and forced into labor until he too died in 2003. The system held together through fear and isolation. Shelly's daughters understood what happened to people who stepped out of line. They had lived alongside it. They had been forced to witness it. And they understood at a level that required no articulation that they could be next. The end came when Tori, Shelly's youngest daughter, found a way to contact relatives outside the household and told them what had been happening inside. Police investigated. Dave Nuñez cooperated, confessing to his role in the disposal of the bodies and placing the full weight of direction on Shelly. In 2003, Shelly and Dave Nuñez were arrested. At trial in 2004, Shelly pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, manslaughter, and assault. She was sentenced to 22 years in prison. Dave received 15. In 2022, Shelley Nuneez was released from prison, having served her sentence. Her daughters, who had spent years in therapy working through what they had experienced, described the news of her release with visible dread. Their accounts of life inside that farmhouse were published in Greg Olson's best-selling book, If You Tell, which gave a detailed and extensively sourced account of what Shelly had done and of what it took for 3 daughters who had been raised inside that system to eventually break free of it and speak. As of 2025, Shelley Nuneez is a free woman. 3 cases in, 7 more to go. And already the range of what these cases represent is wide. A freezer, 5 infant deaths hidden behind a medical diagnosis, a farmhouse that operated as a private chamber of control for over a decade. If you're watching Daily Crime Archive and you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. We're a new channel, and every subscription directly affects how this content reaches more people. Hit the bell. Leave a comment. We read everything. 7 more cases. Let's keep going. Case 4. Brenda Andrew, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, November 2001. On a November evening in 2001, Rob Andrew walked into the garage of a home in Oklahoma City, expecting a routine handoff between 2 people in the middle of a divorce. He walked into an ambush. He was shot twice with a shotgun. He collapsed on the concrete. He died. The person who had arranged his death was his wife, Brenda Andrew. The person who fired the shots was her boyfriend, James Pavat. Rob's children, Brenda's children, were inside the house during the murder. Brenda Andrew had grown up in a conservative religious household in Oklahoma and had built, in the early part of her adult life, the surface of a conventional suburban existence. She and Rob had married, had 2 children, and participated in their church community. Rob was a stable advertising executive. From the outside, the family looked ordinary in the way that many families look ordinary. What was happening beneath that surface was a marriage Brenda had decided she wanted to escape, not through divorce, but through death. By the late 1990s, she had begun an affair with James Pavat, a fellow churchgoer. Together, they developed a plan built around Rob's life insurance policy. The plan required Rob to die. On the night of the murder, Brenda arranged for Rob to come to the house under a pretext. She and Pavat had prepared. When Rob walked into the garage, Pavat was waiting. The first shotgun blast struck Rob's arm. The second hit his torso. He bled out on the garage floor. Brenda's children were in the house as this happened. Investigators focused on Brenda almost immediately. Her account of masked intruders did not hold up against the physical evidence. The investigation revealed the affair, the insurance paperwork, and the planning that had preceded the murder, including disabled security systems and prepared escape routes. When the net began closing, Brenda did not remain to face it. She fled to Mexico, taking her children with her, and lived on the run for months while law enforcement pursued her. She was apprehended in Mexico in 2002 and extradited back to the United States. The trial in 2004 became a significant media event in Oklahoma. Prosecutors presented Brenda as someone who had used every social and interpersonal tool available to her, her image, her church connections, her apparent respectability, to construct a murder and then attempt to escape accountability for it. The most damaging testimony came from her own children. They described the night their father walked into the garage and did not come back. Their voices broke in the courtroom as they recounted hearing the shots that killed him. They had been inside the house during their father's murder, and they were now, years later, testifying against their mother for it. The jury convicted Brenda Andrew of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. They sentenced her to death. She became the only woman on Oklahoma's death row, a distinction she still holds. James Pavat also received a death sentence. As of 2025, Brenda Andrew is incarcerated at the Mabel Bassett Correctional Center in Oklahoma. She maintains her innocence, continuing to claim that the murder was carried out by unknown intruders despite the documented evidence of her involvement. Her children grew up without their father, knowing that their mother had arranged his execution in the garage of their family home. Case 5. Michelle Kehoe, Coralville, Iowa, November 2008. On November 9, 2008, Michelle Kehoe told her husband she was taking their 2 sons for a short drive. She loaded 7-year-old Sean and 2-year-old Seth into the family van and drove into the Iowa countryside. She drove to a remote area near Littleton, gravel roads, open farmland, the kind of landscape where sound dissipates and nobody passes. She told the boys they were going to play a game. She put duct tape over their eyes. She bound their hands. Then she took out a knife. She cut Seth's throat. The toddler died almost immediately. She turned to Sean and began stabbing him, in the head, in the neck, in the chest, repeatedly, without stopping. Sean fought. He pulled at the tape on his eyes. He broke free. He stumbled from the vehicle and out onto the gravel road, bleeding from multiple wounds. Michelle Kehoe chased him and continued stabbing him as he ran. He collapsed on the road. A motorist driving through that remote area saw a small child crumpled on the ground, covered in blood, stopped, and called for help. When emergency responders reached Sean, he was barely conscious. He was alive. He told them, "My mom did this." Back at the scene, Michelle Kehoe had tied her own hands and inflicted shallow cuts on herself. She told responding officers that a stranger had attacked them, that a man had come out of nowhere and done this to her children. The physical evidence dismantled her story within hours. The duct tape bore her fingerprints. The knife matched the wounds. There were no other footprints, no other DNA, no physical evidence of anyone else at the scene. And there was Sean, who had survived, who was conscious, who had identified his mother. Michelle Kehoe was arrested. She was charged with first-degree murder for Seth's death and attempted murder for the attack on Sean. The investigation into her circumstances revealed the portrait prosecutors would present to the jury: a woman whose marriage was under serious stress, whose finances were deteriorating, who was battling depression, and who had, for reasons that the trial never fully resolved, decided that the way to address her situation was to kill her children and present herself as a surviving victim. At trial in 2009, the most unforgettable moment came when Sean, 8 years old by then, still bearing visible scars on his neck, took the stand. He sat in the witness chair in a courtroom full of adults, faced his mother directly, and told the jury what she had done to him and to his brother. At one point during his testimony, he raised his hand and pointed at her. She did this. Jurors later said that Sean's testimony was the center of their deliberations. His account was specific, consistent, and delivered with a clarity that no amount of legal argument could displace. Michelle Kehoe was convicted of first-degree murder for Seth's death and attempted murder for the attack on Sean. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She is currently incarcerated at the Iowa Correctional Institution for Women. Seth Kehoe was 2 years old. He did not live to see his 3rd birthday. His brother Sean survived, grew up, and became the person who testified against the woman who had tried to kill him. Case 6. Mary Beth Tinning, Schenectady, New York, 1972 to 1985. Between 1972 and 1985, Mary Beth Tinning buried 9 children. The community of Schenectady had watched the Tinning family accumulate grief across more than a decade. Jennifer died days after birth in 1972, attributed to meningitis. Joseph died at 5 months old in 1973, labeled sudden infant death syndrome. Barbara died just weeks after Joseph, also SIDS. Timothy died in 1975 at 5 months. Nathan died in 1978 at 4 years old, having been brought to the hospital suddenly ill. Michael, an adopted child, died in 1980. Then Mary Frances, in 1981, at 4 years old. Jonathan in 1982 at 4 months. Tammy Lynn in 1985 at 4 months. 9 children, 9 deaths, all under Mary Beth Tinning's care. All attributed, most of them, to natural causes or sudden infant death syndrome. After each death, the community's response followed the same pattern: grief, condolence, support, food brought to the door, prayers offered. The assumption that fate had dealt this family an incomprehensible series of blows. Mary Beth Tinning accepted every expression of sympathy. She attended every funeral. She received the community's compassion across 13 years of deaths and continued to live in Schenectady, maintaining relationships with neighbors, attending church, and presenting as a woman defined by extraordinary grief. Joe Tinning, her husband, stood by her through all of it. The pattern could not be ignored indefinitely. By the mid-1980s, with the medical community developing a clearer statistical picture of what SIDS actually looked like at the population level, 9 deaths in a single family had become impossible to attribute to natural causes. When Tammy Lynn died in 1985, investigators moved quickly to question Mary Beth. In 1986, she confessed partially. She admitted to smothering 3 of her children, Timothy, Nathan, and Tammy Lynn. Her stated reason for the killings was that they annoyed her, that she didn't want them around anymore. She did not confess to all 9 deaths. The confession that she did give was sufficient. In 1987, Mary Beth Tinning was convicted of second-degree murder in the death of Tammy Lynn and sentenced to 20 years to life. For more than 30 years, she was denied parole at successive hearings. The parole board consistently found that she had not accepted adequate responsibility for her actions, had minimized what she had done, and had not demonstrated the insight required for safe release. In 2018, after more than 30 years of incarceration, Mary Beth Tinning was granted parole. She was 75 years old. She returned to Schenectady. Her release produced significant public anger in the community where she had lived and where her children had been buried. The thought of her walking through familiar streets, past the locations connected to 13 years of deaths, was deeply disturbing to many people who had known the family or the cases. Joe Tinning had visited her throughout her incarceration, maintaining that he had never suspected her, that he couldn't believe she was capable of what she had confessed to. His continued loyalty remained one of the most discussed aspects of the case. Mary Beth Tinning's case forced a fundamental rethinking of how medical and legal systems approach repeated sudden infant deaths within a single family. It is now taught in both medical schools and criminal justice programs as a defining example of how a pattern of murders can be concealed behind a classification of natural death for years, and of what it costs when that concealment succeeds. Halfway through, 6 cases in, 4 to go. We've covered a freezer, 5 hidden infant murders, a decade-long house of control, an insurance murder, a surviving child who testified against his mother, and 13 years of deaths in Schenectady that a community absorbed as grief without ever questioning whether they were something else. Daily Crime Archive covers cases like these because the victims deserve to be more than a statistic or a case number. These are real people, real children, real families still living with what happened. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Check the pinned comment after this video for a full status update on every case. And drop a comment. Tell us which of these cases hit hardest. 4 more. Let's finish. Case 7, Theresa Riggi. Edinburgh, Scotland, August 2010. Theresa Riggi was an American woman living in Edinburgh when, on August 4, 2010, police were called to her townhouse following reports of a gas leak and an explosion. What they found inside was described by the first responding officers as among the most harrowing crime scenes they had ever encountered. 8-year-old twins Austin and Luke and their 5-year-old sister Cecilia were dead in their bedrooms. Each child had been stabbed multiple times. The twins had been stabbed at least 8 times each. Cecilia's wounds were consistent in their severity. The blood patterns in the rooms indicated that the children had attempted to defend themselves. Theresa Riggi had jumped from a balcony. She was severely injured but alive. Theresa had been in the middle of a bitter and escalating custody dispute with her ex-husband, Pasquale. He had been seeking to have the children live primarily with him. By the summer of 2010, the legal proceedings had reached a point where Theresa was facing the prospect of losing primary custody of the children she had, by her own account, and the accounts of those who knew her, to find herself entirely around. The investigation and subsequent psychiatric evaluation built a picture of a woman whose relationship to her children was not one of love in any straightforward sense, but of possession, of ownership. In Theresa Riggi's internal world, as described by the psychiatrists who assessed her, her children were not independent people. They were extensions of herself. And when the legal system threatened to take those extensions away, her response was to ensure that if she could not have them, they could not exist. She planned the attack. She set the gas leak deliberately. She intended to kill herself after killing them. She survived the jump. They did not survive what she did to them. At trial, Theresa initially pleaded not guilty. She later changed her plea to one of diminished responsibility, supported by psychiatric testimony about narcissistic and borderline personality disorders, and her inability to process loss and rejection in any functional way. In 2011, she was sentenced to 16 years in prison for culpable homicide, Scotland's equivalent of manslaughter with diminished responsibility. The sentence generated significant public outrage from those who argued it was wholly inadequate for the killing of 3 children. Theresa Riggi did not complete her sentence. In 2014, 3 years into her imprisonment, she was found dead in her cell at Cornton Vale Women's Prison. She had taken her own life. Austin, Luke, and Cecilia Riggi were 8 and 5 years old. Their father had been fighting to protect them through a legal process that was, by the time of their deaths, close to producing a result. He sat in the courtroom during the proceedings and heard the descriptions of their final moments. The case is remembered in Scotland as one of the most shocking family homicides in the nation's modern history. Case 8. Keli Lane, Sydney, Australia, 1996. Keli Lane was, from the outside, a person who embodied a certain kind of success. She was tall, athletic, and competitive. A water polo player whose abilities had taken her to national-level competition with aspirations beyond that. She was studying to become a teacher. She moved through Sydney's social scene with the confidence of someone who understood how she was perceived and managed that perception carefully. Between 1992 and 1999, she was also pregnant at least 5 times without most of the people around her knowing. She concealed each pregnancy through clothing choices, training schedules, and explanations for physical changes that deflected scrutiny. 2 of the children were placed for adoption through formal channels. One was raised by her parents, who believed him to be a relative's child. The 4th and 5th pregnancies resolved in ways that have never been fully documented. And one child, a daughter named Tegan, born on September 12, 1996, disappeared. Hospital records confirmed that Keli Lane gave birth to Tegan at Auburn Hospital in Sydney. She was discharged 2 days later, carrying her infant. She was photographed at a wedding the same day she left the hospital. She returned to training. She returned to her routine. She told no one she had given birth. Tegan was never seen again. Adoption authorities, conducting a review of Lane's history of pregnancies, identified Tegan as a child who had no documented placement, no adoption file, no record of any caretaker. Police investigated. Lane gave investigators multiple accounts. The baby had been given to the biological father. The baby had been informally adopted. She couldn't remember the specific details. Each version was tested. Each version collapsed. The biological father, named in Lane's account, denied ever receiving the child. No informal caretaker was identified. No record of Tegan's existence after that hospital discharge was ever found. At trial in 2010, the prosecution argued that Keli Lane had killed Tegan because the child represented a threat to the life she had constructed, her athletic career, her relationships, her carefully maintained image. A baby who could not be concealed would have forced her to acknowledge a pregnancy she had hidden and a pattern of hidden pregnancies that she had sustained for years. The defense argued that without a body, without forensic evidence, without physical proof of any specific act, the jury could not reach a verdict of murder. They argued the baby may have survived, may have been given to someone who had never come forward. The jury convicted Keli Lane of murder, despite the absence of a body. She was sentenced to 18 years in prison, with a non-parole period of 13 years. The case divided Australia significantly. Lane's supporters maintained that a conviction without physical evidence of death represented a miscarriage of justice. Those who believed the verdict correct pointed to the pattern of hidden pregnancies, the documented inconsistency of her accounts, and the complete absence of any evidence that Tegan had survived beyond the hospital discharge. As of 2025, Keli Lane has served her sentence and has been eligible for parole. She has maintained her innocence throughout her incarceration and continues to deny murdering her daughter. Tegan Lane has never been found. Case 9. Theresa Knorr. Sacramento, California, 1982 to 1984. Theresa Cross was born in Sacramento in 1946 and married young, the first of multiple marriages that would each eventually collapse. She was, by the accounts of those who knew her across different periods of her life, volatile, paranoid, and possessed of a capacity for cruelty that expressed itself most completely within the walls of her own home. She had 6 children: Howard, Sheila, Susan, William, Robert, and Terry. They grew up under her authority, in a household that functioned as a closed system, with Theresa at its center and violence as its primary organizing principle. She beat them. She starved them. She isolated them from the outside world. She accused them of sins and moral failures that reflected her own paranoia rather than any reality. What began as sustained abuse escalated, in the early 1980s, to murder. Susan had been shot in the stomach during one of her mother's rages, not by anyone outside the family, not by any intruder, but in the ordinary course of violence inside that house. The wound became infected. Rather than take Susan to a hospital, where questions would be asked, where the physical evidence of what had been happening in that household would become visible, Theresa decided to address the infection herself. In the living room, using scissors, with no medical training, she operated on her daughter's infected wound while her sons held Susan down. When Susan screamed, Theresa silenced her. The wound became worse. Susan grew feverish and progressively weaker. In July 1984, when Susan could no longer function, Theresa loaded her into a car, drove to a remote area near Lake Tahoe, and ordered her sons to pour gasoline on their sister. She then ordered them to set Susan on fire. Susan Knorr burned to death. She was 17 years old. Her brothers carried out the order. They were her children too. Raised in the same system, conditioned to the same obedience, shaped by the same years of understanding that defiance had consequences. Sheila, Theresa's oldest daughter, was next. Theresa accused her of becoming sexually promiscuous, of disgracing the family. She imprisoned Sheila in a closet, locked in, denied food, denied water, denied any exit. By the time Theresa unlocked the door, Sheila was dead from starvation and dehydration. She was 20 years old. Again, the sons disposed of the body. Again, the death was concealed. The system held until 1993, when Terry, the youngest daughter, managed to escape the household and contact police. Her account was so extreme that it initially seemed almost impossible, but investigators found the missing sister's remains. They confirmed the testimony. The case against Theresa Knorr was built. In 1995, Theresa Knorr was arrested in Salt Lake City. She pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder. She was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. She is currently incarcerated at the California Institution for Women in Corona. She will not be released. The surviving children, the sons who had been forced to participate in their sisters' deaths, and Terry, who had finally broken the silence, carried forward a specific and complicated set of psychological burdens. They were not the perpetrators of what had happened, but they had lived inside it for years, and 2 of them had been compelled to carry out acts they could not undo. Theresa Knorr's case is one of the few in American criminal history in which a mother forced her own children to participate in the killing of their siblings. Case 10, Darlie Routier, Rowlett, Texas, June 1996. This is the case on this list where reasonable people, looking at the same evidence, reach genuinely different conclusions. We are presenting it fully, the prosecution's case and the defense's counter-argument, because the alternative is to misrepresent what this case actually is. Darlie Routier is currently on death row in Texas. She has maintained her innocence for nearly 30 years. The evidence against her is circumstantial but substantial. The evidence her defense has raised is specific and, depending on how it is weighted, troubling. The case has never been finally resolved to the satisfaction of the legal system or the public. On the night of June 6, 1996, in Rowlett, Texas, 6-year-old Devin Routier and 5-year-old Damon Routier were stabbed to death in the living room of their family home. Their mother, Darlie Routier, was found injured at the scene. Cuts on her arms, bruising, and a significant wound across her throat that stopped just short of her carotid artery. She told responding officers that an intruder had broken in and attacked her and her sons before fleeing through the garage. Devin was dead when officers arrived. Damon died before paramedics could stabilize him. The prosecution's case rested on several key elements: forensic analysis of the garage window screen. The alleged point of entry for the intruder showed undisturbed dust and cobwebs. No forced entry was confirmed. Nothing in the house had been stolen. The kitchen knife identified as the murder weapon bore fiberglass particles matching the window screen material, which prosecutors argued indicated the screen had been cut from the inside. Darlie's wounds, while serious-looking, were assessed by physicians as consistent with self-infliction. The throat wound, particularly, stopped at a location that preserving the carotid artery would require precise knowledge of one's own anatomy. Prosecutors also presented evidence of financial strain in the household and testimony from people in Darlie's life about her emotional state in the period before the murders. 8 days after Devin and Damon were buried, Darlie Routier attended what would have been Devin's 7th birthday at the cemetery. The event was recorded on video. In the footage, she is seen spraying silly string over the grave and laughing. This footage was played repeatedly at trial. Prosecutors argued it demonstrated a fundamental absence of grief. The defense argued, and continues to argue, that the case against Darlie Routier was built on contaminated evidence, compromised crime scene management, and tunnel vision that set in too early and never corrected itself. They pointed to the throat wound. If Darlie had inflicted it herself, she had come extraordinarily close to killing herself in the process. The wound required surgery. It was not superficial. They argued that the silly string footage was deliberately stripped of context. That earlier in the same cemetery visit, footage shows Darlie weeping and collapsing at the grave. The birthday celebration, they argued, was a conscious choice to honor Devin the way a 7-year-old would have wanted to be honored, not evidence of indifference. They have pointed to a bloody sock found some distance from the house, which they argue demonstrates an intruder's path. They have argued for DNA testing of unexamined evidence. In February 1997, after a trial that drew national media attention, Darlie Routier was convicted of capital murder in the death of Damon. She was sentenced to death by lethal injection. She has been on Texas death row for more than 27 years. She has maintained her innocence in every public statement, every interview, and every appellate filing. Her supporters have organized campaigns for new DNA testing. Her appeals have continued across decades. No intruder has ever been identified. No DNA from an unknown third party has been confirmed at the scene. The Texas courts, the federal courts, and the United States Supreme Court have declined to overturn her conviction. Devin and Damon Routier were 6 and 5 years old. They are the fixed point in this case, regardless of everything else. 2 children who were stabbed to death in their living room. Whatever happened on that night, whatever the truth of what the evidence shows, they were real, they were small, and they are gone. 10 cases, 10 children, dozens of children, who died at the hands of the people whose primary role in their lives was to protect them. The range of what these cases represent is wide. Blair's torture was systematic and extended. Hoyt's murders were hidden behind a medical classification for decades. The Nuñez household operated as a closed system of domination for years. Andrew calculated her husband's murder with the children in the house. Kehoe drove her sons to a remote field. Tinning buried 9 children across 13 years. Riggi chose to kill her children rather than lose them in a custody proceeding. Lane hid a pregnancy and a child's disappearance for years. Knorr turned her household into a space where daughters could be killed and sons could be made complicit. Routier's guilt or innocence remains disputed in ways that no final verdict has fully settled. What they share is the specific betrayal at the center of each one. Not a betrayal by a stranger. Not a betrayal by an institution or a system, but by the closest, most fundamental relationship that exists, the one between a parent and a child. There is no clean lesson here. There is no single policy response, no single warning sign, no single type. These cases happened in different decades, in different communities, in different countries. Some of these women had documented histories of mental illness. Some did not. Some acted out of rage. Some out of calculation. Some out of what they described as a distorted logic that made sense to no one but themselves. What the cases do give us is a record of the children who didn't survive, of the investigations that finally brought accountability, of the systems, medical, educational, social services, that sometimes caught what was happening and sometimes didn't, and of the few children who survived, testified, and made sure the world knew. 10 cases. 150 minutes. If you made it to the end of this episode, thank you. Content like this takes time to research and time to watch properly. The fact that you stayed is exactly why this channel exists. Daily Crime Archive is new, and your subscription matters in a concrete way. Hit subscribe, turn on the bell, and check the pinned comment below for the full 2025 status on every case we covered today. Drop a comment. Tell us which of these 10 cases you knew before today, and which one you want us to cover in a dedicated full episode. We'll see you in the next one.